One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Good morning, I5 Space. Thank you to everyone who is tuning in on the I5 YouTube channel or I5 website. And a special thank you to Major General Gagnon for joining us today. I'm Nicole Heselton, I5 STRAT Talk Program Coordinator.
And I'm Evangeline Cernas, your I5 Outreach Team Commander. And as Cadet Heselton said, today we are so delighted to have a very special guest for our talk, Major General Gregory J. Gagnon. He is the Deputy Chief of Space Operations for Intelligence, U.S. Space Force, the Pentagon, Arlington, Virginia. In this capacity, he serves as the Senior Intelligence Officer to the Chief of Space Operations and is responsible to the Secretary of the Air Force and the Chief of Space Operations for Intelligence Policy, Oversight, and the guidance of Space Force intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities. He exercises overall responsibility for the Space Force Intelligence Community Element, which is the 18th member of the U.S. intelligence community. Additionally, he serves as the Chief Service Cryptologic member of the U.S. intelligence community, with delegate authorities from the Director of the National Security Agency. Prior to this assignment, he served as the Director of Intelligence at the U.S. Space Command, Schriever Air Force Base, Colorado.
Major General Gagnon was commissioned through ROTC from St. Michael's College in Winooski, Vermont. He is a career intelligence officer with an extensive background in cyberspace operations. Major General Gagnon has commanded at the squadron, group, and joint levels with one combat command tour in Afghanistan. He is a fully qualified Joint Staff Officer. His staff tours include Pacific Air Forces, Air Force Base Command, Air Combat Command, U.S. Strategic Command, and U.S. Space Command. He has deployed on multiple occasions to support joint air and special operations. Sir, thank you so much for being here today.
Happy Thursday. It's great to be here. It's great to see your faces. And we got another cadet here in the room. So I'm going to give him a little bit of warning. I may drag him in halfway through the interview. So I just wanted to share that just so we could stress him out a little bit. Okay.
Awesome.
Awesome. Hey, before we start, I just wanted to share with you a few things. And it may seem crazy that I say this, but I want to thank you for choosing to serve.
Thank you, sir.
Our nation doesn't continue unless people choose to serve. We don't draft people anymore. We just use volunteers. And although some of us made that decision, 30, 35 years ago, the only way it continues is by people your age making that decision today. So I'm very grateful to get to spend time with you. I know sometimes it may not be cool to be in the military. Maybe in some campuses it is cool, but I'm looking forward to, through the questions, hearing about how it is for you. And I'll tell you how it has been for me. So thanks for letting me join you today. I'm really excited.
Awesome. Thank you, sir.
Sir, seeing as you started off your military career at ROTC and both the cadets, Cernas and I are cadets at ROTC, could you talk about your experience in the program?
Oh, yeah, I'd love to. And let me dispel some myths. So like when I entered the United States Air Force, there were these folks around me who had wanted to join the Air Force since they were in diapers. I mean, I think they were in diapers and learning how to drink out of a sippy cup when they knew they wanted to fly airplanes, okay? And they were so gung-ho. But there was this other guy in the ROTC detachment, and it was me. And I raised my right hand because I had to pay for school. I didn't have the means to attend college. My family was doing what they could, but they knew, this wasn't something that we could afford. So ROTC was key for me to get an education. And that's literally what drove me in there. I share that because everyone feels a sense of guilt when they say that, when I talk to them and they're cadets. There's nothing to feel guilty about. There's nothing to feel guilty about. I'll also share with you that I thought I was going to do 4 years and be done because I had other plans. And those 4 years are now 30. So that's how it started for me. I'll also share with you that I went to school in Vermont. So, and this was the early 90s. And in Vermont, there wasn't a large military presence. And being in the military was a little unique. I will tell you, I went to a school where the ROTC detachment was super small. And it was super small, so much that the year after I graduated, they closed the detachment. So my school was the host unit for all schools in Vermont, with the exception of Norwich, which was a military academy. So there were people from Johnson State, from the University of Vermont, from Middlebury. They all came to St. Mike's for ROTC. But at our college, St. Michael's, I was the only graduate my year, even though we started with a whole bunch. And I think a lot of you see that in your own detachments, right? You start with 100 and you end with 40, right? That is not an uncommon thing to have happen in ROTC. But those were some of the dynamics for me. And the key for me was kind of getting the scholarship. They asked me, when I was kind of going through my scholarship board, they said, if you don't get a scholarship, are you going to stay in ROTC? And I said, sir, I wish I could say yes, but I can't, because I got to get another job. I already had a job. I had two, and I couldn't make time and space for that kind of thing, because I wanted to stay in school. And he thanked me for my honesty. And I think that was part of integrity first. And I think that helped me kind of get my scholarship and get to be a second lieutenant.
Awesome. So then, based on your experience, sir, what led you to intelligence? And then specifically, what led you to intelligence in the Space Force?
Okay. So those are two different questions. So I'll take the first one. Is Cadet Gagnon's trying to figure out what he wants to do, right? So
Right.
Cadet Gagnon's raised his hand. He's an upperclassman now, and he knows he's going to be a second lieutenant. And I'm sitting with my professor of aerospace studies, and he's like, well, why don't you fly? I said, how long is the commitment? And he said, it's like 7 years at the time. And I said, yeah, I don't think so. Okay. I said, what are the shortest commitments that I can do in ROTC, and what are those job hours? So we went through that. And I was in economics and major, and kind of Asian studies as well. And he said, hey, what about finance? Why don't you check that out? So, in your summer where you go for 2 weeks and you shadow somebody. So I did that. And I went from upstate Vermont, green, lush, beautiful, and I went to Altus, Oklahoma. Okay. So very different climate, environment, a lot of browns, shades of gray, not a lot of growth of vegetables and stuff. So it was very different environment. And I shadowed a finance officer, and I came back from that and I said, I don't think I want to be a finance officer in the Air Force. So I know I got an economics degree. He says, hey, you love to travel. I was an exchange student in Japan when I was in college. And he says, so why don't you be an intel officer? I said, what do they do? He goes, they can live anywhere in the world. They do lots of different things. I said, sign me up. All right. That sounds like my gig. So I signed up for that. I said, how long's the commitment? He said, 4 years. I said, you're speaking my language, boss. So I said, that's what I'll do. And that is the limit of how much thought I put into this, right? Because when I was Cadet Gagnon, I was doing my 4 years, and my plan was to kind of do international finance as a career, because that's what I studied a little bit in school, the economics of international finance. And that's what I studied when I went to school in Japan as well. Because believe it or not, when I was in college, we thought the Japanese economy was going to take over the world. That's how much the world can change. Just,
Gotcha. So then, I guess the second part of that question then, what led you to intelligence in the Space Force?
So I will tell you, the Space Force as an independent service didn't exist when I was a cadet. And honestly, my activities with space and space intelligence didn't begin until I was a full colonel. Prior to that, I was doing very much air combat and air and intel support to special operations, and what we call sort of intelligence operations, kind of using our UAVs, which are our remotely piloted aircraft, our RPAs, and our U-2 and our spy planes, and using those to collect information, right? That's what I had done for the first 18 years of my career. And in the last 12, I started to do things that were more broader than that. I did cyberspace operations. I did intelligence support to space operations. And when the Space Force was being established, the head coach of Space Force, which was General Raymond, who went on to be the first chief of space operations. He gave me a phone call and he says, Greg, I need a senior intel officer and I'd like you to come over and be that person. And General Lauterbach, who is now the senior intel officer in the Air Force, she's my partner in crime, if you will. She was in a position out in Colorado in a joint job. And he says, I want you to backfill her in that job. And she's going to come up to the Pentagon and be the first senior intel officer of the Space Force. But she's going to stay in the Air Force because she's going to go back to the Air Force after. I said, okay. He goes, you can do those jobs following her, but you can stay in the Air Force or not. And he goes, I want you to think about it. So my wife and I sat down and we talked about it. And for me, a couple of the decision factors were I wanted to play for the head coach. I had worked for him before. He's an amazing officer. So I wanted to play for the head coach. 2, I knew that at this stage in my career, I was pretty much a staff officer the rest of my career because I'm inside the military, although I don't look it. I'm the old man, okay? So inside the military, I'm at the end of my career where I am kind of doing staff functions. So I knew that I wasn't going to command a squadron, command a wing, or anything like that again. So I was like, I realized that. And then the third thing was if I had come over, I would have considerable decision authority to mold the intelligence service in a way that I wanted to, in a way that is a kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity. So I was on board with it. And then the second part was, did I change to the Space Force? And Johanna and I, we talked about that a lot. And I thought that inside the Space Force, the intelligence elements, which are 14% of the uniformed people in the Space Force are intelligence specialists. I thought that when they looked up, they would want to see themselves, right, as a way to, hey, I could be a general officer and be an intelligence person. So I said, I'm going to make the shift. I'm going to make the shift. And my wife and I, we went back and forth about that a lot because for 27 years I was in the Air Force and I love the Air Force and I had a wonderful Air Force career and so did Johanna. And I said, I think I got to change the uniform now. And she's like, okay. And then we did it. We don't regret it. We actually look back and the hesitations we've had, they seem to have actually been unfounded, but change is hard, change is hard.
Wow. Thank you, sir. That's so cool.
Our next question is going to be along the same lines of the intelligence route, but focusing on the Space Force overall. Seeing as the Space Force took on an intelligence or surveillance role while it was still incorporated in the Air Force, do you see the Space Force primarily taking on that same role, or do you see the role expanding in different ways?
Okay, so neither of you two expected this, but what do you think the role of a service is, right? The services are the Marine Corps, the Navy, right? The Army, right? The Air Force, and the Space Force. What do you think their roles are when you think about it? Like, what is it that they're supposed to do as military services?
Do you mean in terms of their objectives? In ROTC recently, there's been like a big push because there was a study that showed that a lot of cadets didn't know the main objectives of the Air Force or the objectives of the Space Force. So are you talking about like their specific mission sets? So like I know the Space Force's objective is space superiority, but the Air Force is air superiority, ISR, combat and command, rapid global mobility, and global strike. But I don't know about the other branches. I don't know what their stuff is, but that's the answer I can give you.
So that was excellent, by the way. So the fifth one for the Air Force is command and control, right? So the way I tell this story is I try to, and I will tell you, the American public doesn't fully understand this, but like for each of the services, right, they're each unique and different for a particular reason. They do their warfighting function in unique domains, if you will. If you're in the Navy, what America expects from you is that we can sail our Navy somewhere and control the sea, right? We can control that environment, that's the sea. And then once we control that environment, we can do military functions from that environment. We call that exploiting the advantage, right? Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Yep. And then the third thing you have to do is you got to be able to get to where you're going in that environment. So we'll call that access to it. So for the Navy, they do that with ships. But did you ever wonder why the Navy has airplanes? Right? Because
Okay.
everybody thinks the Air Force does Air Force stuff, right? Because the primary function of the Navy is actually control of the domain. And they use all elements of military power to do that. So having airplanes that fly off of ships or fly from the coastline is very important in them seizing their area, right? And having dominance over that area. The Marines have a unique function and they're from the sea. They're that landing force that launches from their maritime platform to gain access along coastal areas. That's the primary point of the Marine Corps, to be very light, to be very nimble, and do that function. For the Air Force, the primary function of the Air Force, the first function, right, the most important, is to gain control of the air, right?
Yeah.
So that other air forces can't drop bombs on our Navy and our Army, okay? But once we have control of the air, their second function is to use the high ground and exploit that for military advantage. That can be done through long range bombing, right? You called it global strike. That can be done through putting sensors in that area or that domain and doing sense making, right? And like looking down, right? That's ISR, if you will, right? The third thing you can do if you control the air is you can use the air to move people very rapidly and move equipment very rapidly. That's global mobility, right? Rapid mobility. An amazing change that very few countries have the ability to do on the scale we can do, okay? And then finally, if you're controlling the air, you're launching long range fires through the air or bombers through the air, and you're moving equipment and personnel through the air. You got to be able to coordinate all that and orchestrate all that. That's command and control. So those are those functions of the Air Force. If you follow that analogy of each service, okay, and of course the Army is to control the land area in which they projected land into, right? If you follow that analogy, the first function of the Space Force is to be able to control the parts of space, outer space, that we need to do our military functions. That need to do control of that space environment, we call it space control, is space superiority. That is the first function of the Space Force. So once we have the ability to operate in space to do what we want and prevent others from doing what they want if we're in conflict with them, we then exploit that domain. And just like the other services, what are some things that we would want to do to exploit that domain if we had control? History tells us that having the high ground in military operations is incredibly useful, right? If we go back to when we started as a country, the high ground would be on top of some hill with a binocular or a monocle, right? Looking down, trying to see where the other forces are, and then using flags, right? To tell people, hey, the enemy's over there. You can't see them because you can't see over the hill, but I can see over the hill.
Right.
So exploiting the high ground on the ground was something we used to do, or you wanted to have as an advantage. When you had control of the air let you do that on a much grander scale, right? And when you had control of the air, when they were up in those biplanes, right, with their goggles on and their leather caps, they wanted to communicate down to the ground. So they would use like signal flags and stuff like that. They would do that out of balloons too. Then we invented the radio and then we could send reports down, right? Those same functions, that exploitation of the air, are the things that are the secondary functions of your United States Space Force. How do we exploit outer space for military advantage? We did that as part of the Air Force, and we will continue to do that as part of the Space Force. The thing that has changed in the security environment, okay, and the reason you have a United States Space Force is because our ability to use outer space at the time and place of our choosing has to be gained and then maintained. 15 years ago, it was ours by default because we didn't have an adversary challenging us in outer space that could prevent us from having that space superiority. And if we don't have that space superiority, those other things that we do, seeing from the ultimate high ground to help inform airmen, sailors, soldiers, and Marines, that could go away. Also, some of the people that may want to take freedom away from other freedom-loving people, they can use outer space to see further, guide their weapons, and project power. As you try to control space, you have to eliminate their ability to use it as well. That's conflict. That's warfare that will extend to space. That's why you have a United States Space Force.
Thank you, sir.
That was a long answer. I'm sorry.
No, that was
Perfect.
great, sir. Along with that, then, can you expand a little bit more on ISR and its role in space superiority? I know you just spoke about space superiority, but I guess specifically how intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance will affect our safety as a nation.
Cernus, you're killing it, by the way. This interview's, you're doing great. Now, let me tell you something that's new, okay? So if you have to deliver space superiority, right? You kind of have to know what the adversaries are doing in outer space, right? You have to be able to be on the ground looking up, right? And when you look up, you need to see what their satellites are doing on the off chance that some of their satellites are weapons, right? You also have to look deep inside their country in case they're using weapons on the ground, okay, to attack things in space. And you have to watch that every day. That is intelligence support to space superiority. Do you know that our adversaries have, weapons that they're using to challenge us in outer space? There are missiles today that launch from the ground. The Russians demonstrated one a couple of years ago. The Chinese demonstrated one in 2007 that launch from the ground and destroy satellites in outer space. So we need to watch those weapons, right, to make sure that we know where they are and what they intend to do. There are also lasers on the Earth that can be used as weapons to blind imaging satellites that are like your iPhone. So they're electro-optical, right? And they can blind basically the camera on your iPhone from the ground. There's even lasers on the ground that are so powerful that they can destroy components of a satellite. Our adversaries, the People's Liberation Army, right, have those weapons. There's also satellites in outer space that can be used as weapons as well, that both the Russians and the Chinese have in outer space. So as the intelligence part of the Space Force, it is our job to watch that stuff every day, 24/7, on Thanksgiving, on Christmas, and on 4th of July, because we stand watch to guard freedom and liberty. Think about Moscow and Beijing. Do they want you to have free speech? Do they want you to have the freedom to assemble? Do they want you to be able to vote for who you want to vote for? No. So if they gain military advantage, they will try to impose their will on people beyond their borders. And we see them doing that in geopolitics today. That's why you have a United States Space Force. We can't give them that advantage from outer space.
Got it. Thank you, sir.
Moving away from the intelligence aspect of the Space Force and more into your experience as an officer, your bio talks about how you are a fully qualified Joint Staff Officer. Could you speak a little bit more about what that is and what your responsibilities in that role were?
I'm gonna give you leadership hack 101. Okay, so grab a pen. I want you to write this down. If you don't have a pen, have someone throw one at you because I know you're online. Okay. All right.
I have it.
Nicole, you got a pen?
Yes, sir.
All right, here we go. The team you lead is much smaller than the team you're on. So whether your Corps of Cadets is like 15 people or 40, you're usually part of a bigger team. In the Department of Defense, in order for us to succeed in warfare, it is important that all the services, the sailors, the Marines, the soldiers, the airmen, and the guardians, employ together as a joint team. And during your career, if you're lucky, you'll get the opportunity to join organizations that lead people from all those services in order to do operations, because that's how we do operations. We plan, we orchestrate, and we give orders down to the different formations in our organization of a joint force. So if we're gonna do air operations and you're in a joint command, you usually call the person who's the senior aviator, who's been appointed as that joint leader, and you say, these are the things that you need to do to support the overall war campaign. If you're in a joint headquarters and you have some land part of the war, you call your senior land officer. It could be a Marine or it could be an Army officer, and you tell them, these are the things we need to do. And then those subordinate headquarters help orchestrate all elements across the joint force in order to deliver the outcomes. So those are generally done to build officers to understand how to employ the whole team. That's why you do joint assignments, because at the end of the day, if we have to defend the nation or we have to project power, we do it as part of a joint team. So I've had the opportunity to serve in a few places as a joint officer. I thoroughly enjoy it. The services are different because of a couple of key factors. Their primary function, right? Remember we talked about that, their primary role, it's different for each services. So in each of those different tasks, different things become important. You will find that in the Marine Corps, it is very much, it's about 180,000 folks in the Marine Corps, okay? It's mostly very junior enlisted force, okay? The Marine Corps model is generally they bring in a lot of people and it makes up the bottom of the pyramid, and most of that pyramid does not do 20 years as a career, okay? If you look at the Air Force as a model, it's very highly technical. It takes a long time to give people their initial skills to do their wartime tasks because it's highly technical. So the Air Force generally wants to get 2 or 3 assignments out of people. And once you have 2 or 3 assignments out of people, they generally want to stay. So that pyramid looks a little different. But the way the services handle that is generally our enlisted force does the vast majority of the work. And our enlisted force, if we're trying to retain them, you have to have a climate that makes them want to re-enlist. So each service has different targets for re-enlistment. Each service has different benefits, basically, for what's expected of their enlisted corps. Each service has different education requirements in the growth and maturity and the maturation of their enlisted corps. And I would tell you, each service has truly a different dynamic in officer enlisted relations. In the Navy, there's parts of a ship that are called officer country, where the enlisted don't go. Yeah. In the Marine Corps, there's a very large officer to enlisted ratio because it's mostly enlisted. In the Air Force, it's more mingled with the high technology stuff and it's less rigid. So every service is different. And those differences between officer and enlisted relations drive different climates in those organizations. And I've had the opportunity to see this firsthand because I've worked in multiple different joint assignments where I've worked not just with different enlisted from each of the services, but different officers as well. And each one of us, as we get older, is an expert in our particular thing, but we don't know much about the other thing. Like I could not drive a ship. I wouldn't know what formation to put ships in to gain advantage. So we're all different for a reason. But the key premise goes back to the first thing. And Nicole, what was the first thing I said that was I wanted you to write down?
The team you lead is smaller than the team you're on.
Yep. So think about how you work with your peers and how you work with your boss to deliver the best answer. Because when we go to war as a joint force. We don't go to war as a Space Force and an Air Force. We go to war as a joint force.
Thank you, sir.
So then I guess on the topic of the different branches, how have you or how did you find the culture of each branch come together or how it differed when working together? Because I know that the culture will change based on the branches, like how you were saying with the climate and the enlisted to officer ratio. So yeah, if you could speak on how you found that in your time serving as a joint staff officer.
Yeah, I would tell you that that is the role of leadership. And
Mm.
one of the things I often do is, let's say I have a group of people and a third are from the Navy, 10% are from the Marine Corps,
Mhm.
and a third is from the Air Force, and the rest is Army, and there's a couple Space Force folks. Okay, if that is the distribution of my force, right, it's important that I understand them. So if I have the opportunity to pick my leadership team, okay, and remember, I'm Space Force, right, and only maybe 2% or 1% of that formation is Space Force. Do you think my deputy that I would choose should be like me? Should be a Space Force officer, or should it be someone who would come with a different perspective? And as I choose my senior enlisted leader, should I choose someone that has the same experiences as me, or somebody who sees the room differently than me?
Mhm.
So I actually think about hiring diversity of experience into my leadership team, because I know that when I walk into a room, I see the room a certain way. But what I want is, and the way I see it isn't always the right way. Okay.
Yeah.
And often other people come in the room and they see different things because they've had different experiences. So I try to highlight that on my leadership team, because that gives me a better understanding of not just the organization, but it also tends to give me better options on how to solve a problem, because people think through their own mental frames. And the other thing I would share with you, if you still got your pens, is everyone is a prisoner of their own experience. Okay. So we all have unintentional blinders on that are called unconscious bias. I try to work on finding mine, because that makes me, better kung fu as a leader. But I want to be able to see the whole picture holistically. And I have found that as I choose people from different services to help me on joint leadership teams, it helps me see the problem better.
Gotcha. Thank you, sir.
Moving to the topic of leadership, how have you embraced the 4 C's of the Space Force in your current position? And how is that different from the motto of the Air Force and how you took on that role when you were still part of the Air Force?
Okay. I will tell you that one of the things I did was, I'd been in the Air Force for 27 years. So I would walk into a room, right? And integrity, service before self, and excellence in all we do. I had built a whole library, and here's the library, by the way, of stories that I would share with people that would help reinforce those principles and why those principles were a bedrock of the service. When I transferred over to the Space Force, and I printed these out last night as I launched them from my iPhone iNote to my work email, right? So I can print them out. That's where I keep these stories. These are stories about, excellence in what we do. They're stories about integrity. Some of them are stories about courage already. And I've adjusted those stories because fundamentally, if you look at each of the services and what their core values, they're all very similar, right? They're all very similar because integrity is important, courage is important, right? Character is important, commitment's important. But the key one for the Space Force that was unique was kind of connectedness. That was one that we hadn't seen in the other services when they talked about that. The other services talk about it in a roundabout way about esprit de corps. How do you create sort of the hoorah inside the formation? And that's the connectedness in the Space Force. And our hoorah is a little different about what people connect over. So I liked that as sort of I don't know if that's the second or the 4th C, but connectedness is important. The thing that connectedness brings me to is to have true connectedness, you have to spend time together. You can send the email and you can send the text to check up on people. That only really works if you already have a connection with them that's real. So it's important to invest time in your team, to know what's going on your team, to know what the struggles are at home, the struggles are in life, and the struggles are at work. And I have this other kind of leadership principle that I never regret the time I spend inside the formation with the team socially. Like, I have to give something up to do that. So whether I was the commander or the ops officer or the general, going to the team, the unit picnic, playing on the team, the softball team, right? Just all of that time was incredibly important to grow roots into my organization, because when they needed help, they needed to already have connectedness, because then they felt comfortable enough to reach out. You can't build it after a crisis.
Gotcha. So coming full circle with leadership, is there anything that you wish you knew early on in your career as a second lieutenant to now? And I guess the second part of that question would be, is there a specific mentality that you felt like helped you as you progressed through those positions? Do you feel helped you the most?
Okay. Your question broke up due to baud rate, but I think I know what it is. It's like, hey, do you wish, what would you tell yourself if you were a second lieutenant today, as advice? And then, so I'll start with that one. So I will share with you that when I was very junior, so I was a company grade officer and a captain, I started developing a leadership philosophy. And that leadership philosophy was a series of statements that I wanted to be, right? And I wrote it down and I carried it around for a long time. I actually carried that piece of paper around till 15 months ago. Okay. And it's in the back of my notebook. And let me grab something. Okay.
Okay.
So I've had a notebook like this that I've been carrying around since I was a captain. Okay. And in the back of these notebooks, they have a little pocket, and in there I would slide in my leadership philosophy. And in the early days, my leadership philosophy was a series of quotes I would read in a leadership book, and I was like, that's awesome, right? Like, I write it down, right? And then I tried to make sure I only had like 10 to 15. And most of them came from someone named Colin Powell and someone named Stephen Covey, which are kind of like, one's obviously General Powell, and the other one's Stephen Covey, which is like a leadership coach. And I would use those and I carried them around. And the purpose of carrying them around was to pull them out and read them and say, all right, Greg, how'd you do this week? And at about the same time, which is when I'm a captain, I started to keep a journal, a leadership journal. And if I was more confident in myself, I'd call it a diary, because it's literally a diary, right? But it was my leadership journal, and I started keeping it then, and I have kept it to today. I wrote in it 2 days ago, so I have kept the leadership journal. And what I tried to do is each week look at this, because this was my leadership yardstick. Did I live up to my own expectation? What didn't I do good this week? What did I do this week? And I've done that throughout my career. That self-reflection has been very important in getting better at who I am. Other people give you feedback all the time, but what you need to do is make sure that you define success yourself, and then you measure yourself and continue to move forward. I will tell you that a year and a half ago, this card doesn't look like it used to, because a year and a half ago, I gave my card when I commissioned her to my O1, right, who's my daughter, okay? And then she, a couple weeks later, sent this to me, which was her handwriting my stuff back to me. So I still carry this, and our team's in the joint force. That's all I'm saying.
Love that. Thank you, sir.
Yep.
Our final question is, do you have any advice for those who want to make a difference in space and beyond?
In space, and what was the latter part?
Beyond.
Oh, you got kind of sci-fi-ish with me. Okay. All right. So let me share this with you. This will shock you guys. Okay. I am not a Star Trek person. I'm not yeah, I know. Like, I saw your eyes go up, right? Like, how could that be? Yeah. I'm an intel officer. So the people I'm trying to understand and the people I'm trying to influence are either in DC because they're leadership and I need them to understand what the PLA are doing or what the Russian army is doing. But my focus is really on those adversaries, right? The Russians and the Chinese. And space for me is a means to an end, which is about trying to expand US national security objectives. So space is a means to an end, right? And that's how I try to highlight to other people about outer space. But if I could pivot a little bit, if your passion is about space sciences and sciences in space, you should pursue your passion. Your passion is probably better aligned to NASA, right? If your passion is about defending the United States, defending our allies, and defending our principles, you should join a military service who does that for space. That's us. The American public is confusing the two quite frequently, and it could be because of silly TV shows, but the US Space Force is part of the combat arms of the Department of Defense. That's our purpose. Space science supports what we do, but it's not what we do.
Thank you so much, sir. That concludes all of our questions. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. We really appreciate it.
I appreciate what you two are doing. It's great to see you. I will tell you, get over here. Let's go. All right, you're gonna introduce yourself. You're gonna sign some disclosure thing that you like this idea, but yeah. Missouri, you said?
Yes, University of Missouri. I'm Cadet Sir Mackwitz. I'm an Arnold Air Society representative here interning at the Pentagon this summer. It's good to see you guys. We don't have I-5 at my detachment, unfortunately. We don't have a big space presence, so it's cool to see what you all are doing.
All right, so I'll sign us off for
Sir Mackwitz.
I'm gonna get it right. Okay, Sir Mackwitz and Gagnon from the Pentagon. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too, sir.